Marvellous. Let's get cracking in that case, and given that's now 1 minute past 12. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this, which is the second of our deep dive series, looking at in-depth at our Cities Outlook report that came out last week, understanding what that means for cities and large towns within particular regions. Yesterday we did the Northeast. Today, as you all know, is the turn of the Northwest. So what I'm going to do is to give a presentation of what's going on, what the report says about the cities in the Northwest, and then take questions at the end. My name is Paul Swinney. I'm Director of Policy Research here at the Centre for Cities and led on the work. If you have any questions during the presentation, please do put them in the chat or in the question and answer box, and I will come to them at the end. So don't hesitate to put them in, and then I will get round to answering as many of those as I can in the time that we have left. We'll aim to go for half an hour, and I'll try my best to stick to that as best we can as well, which will partly be dependent on the questions that we receive. So, what does Cities Outlook mean for the Northwest? Well, first off, a little bit of background about what Cities Outlook is for those who might not know. It is the annual health check of UK cities that we do every January. It is well known for its top 10, bottom 10s of tables that it puts at the back of the report on a whole range of different indicators, which is a permanent fixture in all the 18 outlooks now that we've produced. But each year we have a special focus in the main chapter. And this year, this special focus was about wages, and it's about how is the industrial strategy and the local growth plans that the government has asked the mayors in particular to write. What should they look like? What should they be trying to do if they are going to try and boost wages across the country and within both urban and non-urban areas within each region of the country as well? So let's go through and talk about what that means for cities in the Northwest. First off is this chart, which looks at wages, and it does two things. First is it shows wages across each region of the UK, but then splits each region into urban, which is the light green bar, and then non-urban, which is the dark green bar. And a number of things to note from this chart. First one is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a lot of variation across the country. Some regions, workplace wages are much higher than others, principally the Greater South East, but Scotland actually does relatively well as well. You can see there that Northwest is sort of middle of the pack. Certainly does better than other regions in the North and Midlands, but is below the UK average when it comes to pay. The second one to note is that in every region of the UK, the light green bar is taller than the dark green bar, which tells us that in every region, cities pay higher wages than their surrounding non-urban areas in every region. And there's a good reason for this. It's because urban areas offer access to a whole range of things that high-skilled businesses are looking for that non-urban areas just inherently don't offer. The cities really do lead their regions in every part of the country. But the big challenge is that when you then look at the variation, point 3, between cities, you can see relative to non-urban areas, you can see that variation is much greater for cities than it is non-urban areas. And the variation that we see in wages across the country, therefore, is not driven by the underperformance of non-urban areas, largely speaking, it's driven by the underperformance of cities. And that's principally why we see these such large differences in wages that we see. So understanding what drives that, now we try and improve the performance of cities is important then for not only sort of prosperity within that city itself, but also the wider region too, given the way that people commute into those cities to access those high-paid jobs. So let's break this down a little bit and understand why that's the case. First thing to say in terms of trying to understand this is we should split the business base into two broad groups. So you've got your local service businesses on the one hand. They're ones that sell to very much a local market. So think about hairdressers, newsagents, cafes, bars, restaurants. They're serving a local neighbourhood, or they're attracting people in off the street in terms of how they make their money. It is very much that local market that they're selling to. The second type of business is what we describe as being exporting businesses. So there will be businesses that sell their wares, goods or services to a national market or an international market. They're basically selling beyond the city and beyond the region and bringing the money in as a result of the things that they sell. And this chart here splits the performance of those two splits the performance of those two groups out so we can understand which part of the economy should we be focusing on. So if we look at the dark green dots first, that's the productivity of local service businesses like hairdressers, cafes, bars, restaurants across all the 63 urban areas, or 62 urban areas in this instance, that we look at. As you can see there, that a couple of things. First off is that local services productivity tends to be pretty low. Second is that there's not a great deal of variation between cities. This is not the performance of these high street type businesses, and not the reason why we see this variation across the country. And if you think about that, a hairdresser in Burnley is probably as productive as a hairdresser in Plymouth, for example. They cut a certain number of heads of hair an hour. They're fairly constrained about the variation that they get in that. And so you tend to see the performance of those businesses being pretty similar. Where we do see a lot of differences in those lighter green dots, which is the output of the productivity of exporting type companies. Think manufacturing, think finance, think IT, think software app development, those types of things. And here we see there's a much greater amount of variation. Not only are they higher productivity in general, they're the ones that are driving the prosperity engine within a city, but also there's a much greater amount of variation across them. And certainly cities in the Great Southeast in particular, towards the left-hand side there, very productive export bases. And we know from the wider work and the research that they then have higher wages as a result. Looking at the cities in the northwest, you get a bit of a mix. So you have got some places like Manchester, Liverpool, Preston, and even Birkenhead. Their export base is sort of sitting around the national average in terms of productivity. So doing okay. I think in Manchester and Liverpool's basis perspective in particular, probably should be above the national average rather than sit at the national average. But actually, the export base they have is fairly productive. If we go a little bit further to the right there, then you can start to see places like Blackburn, Blackpool, Wigan, Burnley, etc., coming out as much further down that list. And very much, the low wages that are being paid in those areas are a result of the fact that their export base, that part that should be the prosperity generator, is probably not performing as well as maybe what we would like. Certainly, if we want to see higher wages in these places. So that gives you sort of an overview of it is the export base we should be thinking about, and we see varying performance. But what are the things? Why does this performance vary? What are the things we should be thinking about for colleagues who might well be writing local growth plans at the moment? What are the things that we should use to measure that export base, to understand that performance? And so what the report then does is it looks at 5 different indicators that local areas should be thinking about when they're assessing their export base and trying to think about what is it that they should do about it. So what I'm going to do now is run through those 5 and put the cities of the northwest in context. First one is size. If you've got a large export base, a large prosperity generating engine, then you're probably going to be bringing in more money than one that is fairly small. And this chart here shows that there's a positive relationship between the size of the export base, that thing that we really need to be focusing on, and average wages. So a number of successful places in the southeast in particular are towards the right there. They have larger export bases, and you can see from the slope of that relationship that they tend to pay higher workplace wages as well. Towards the left, you can see much more dominated, that bottom left-hand corner, much more dominated by places outside the Greater Southeast, where actually their export base isn't particularly large and their wages are low as a result. You can see here that all of the cities in the northwest are being picked out by the red dots. Didn't quite have space to put all of the labels on, but we'll come back to the specifics on that later. But you can see there, a number of northwest cities are the wrong side of that vertical line. They have smaller export bases than what their population would predict. And there's a real challenge there about, even if you like Manchester and the productivity of our export base is relatively good, at least it hits the national average, it isn't very big. So it's sort of generating a relative amount of prosperity, but actually the size of it means that it's not, or its performance is quite good, but the size of it means that there isn't a great deal of prosperity then to generate for the wider area, which has implications for how well Manchester performs more generally. And certainly you can see here, like the likes of Manchester, Liverpool and Birkenhead, very much to the left of that chart, much smaller export bases than what we'd expect. And that causes challenges, particularly for Manchester and Liverpool, not just for their performance in their own right, but because they are big places, for the prosperity of the northwest more generally as well. Number 2, talked about size, but composition is important as well. And particularly from a composition perspective, is that if you attracted in export jobs but they're low skilled, then you've still got a problem. You need a high-skilled export base, not just an export base. And the way we sort of try to measure this and get a bit of a proxy for it is to look at the share of, or the number of cutting-edge businesses that a place is trying to attract. Because it's these cutting-edge businesses that are coming up with new ideas, new innovations that are probably going to drive the economy on. If your place is good at attracting these types of businesses in, think fintech, think AI, those types of activities, think life sciences, then you're probably quite well placed to grow in the future. But if you're struggling to attract those parts into your export base, then you're going to have more of a challenge. And this map here shows, in general, again, greater cities in the Greater Southeast have been much more successful at attracting and growing the emerging cutting edge of the economy, which you can see there from the darker dots. In the Northwest, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. You've got Warrington there, which is doing quite well. You've got Manchester, which is doing okay, but there are also a number of very pale dots on that map as well, suggesting that there are a number of cities that aren't doing particularly well at attracting this cutting edge of the economy in particular that local growth plans should definitely be thinking about. Number 3 is adaptation. So how well has the export base adapted over the last 40 or 50 years to the changes in both national and the global economy? And the way we measure this is the share of jobs in that export base which are in manufacturing and services. Now, what we know going all the way back to 1981, which as far as the data goes back, is that every city, I think bar Exeter, had more than half of their jobs in their export base in manufacturing. But fast forward 50 years, and what we see that declines everywhere. Every city apart from Burnley, interesting from the Northwest perspective, now has more than half of their jobs in services activities. And what we also know is that, if we then look at this chart here, is that those places that have a higher share of jobs in service type activities in their export base also pay higher wages, which you can see here was, again, a positive correlation. And that's telling us that those cities that have been able to adapt more to the changing winds of the global economy and move more into service-focused exports are the ones that tend to be more prosperous today. Now, I think that's particularly important because if the local growth plans being written now are anything like the growth plans that have been written in the past, advanced manufacturing will take a very prominent role in that writing. Now, that isn't to say that advanced manufacturing isn't important, but at the same time, we shouldn't overstate the role of advanced manufacturing. And given that we expect the UK economy to continue to specialise in high-end services, very much thinking about where the deficits are in high-end services is going to be at least as important as thinking about how to try and take advantage of any manufacturing strengths that a place might have. Speaking of key strengths, moves us on to number 4, which is diversification. So what this chart shows, or this map shows, is of the export base, what share of jobs are in any one particular industry. So basically trying to show, is it a diversified base, or actually have you got a bit of a one-horse town in terms of your over-reliance on any one particular sector? Aberdeen is the UK's city closest to being a one-horse town, where 1 in 2 jobs, half of jobs in its export base are in oil and gas, at least, in terms of how we can capture that. Very vulnerable to, or not very vulnerable, very dependent on the performance of oil and gas. Then places like Plymouth, Doncaster, Sunderland also very much reliant as well. Interestingly, in the Northwest perspective, actually most of the cities there are fairly diversified in terms of their export base, which we think is probably a good place to be in terms of future performance, because if you're very reliant on one sector today and then that sector starts to wobble, you've got a challenge there. We know that from the declines in textiles, for example, from the Northwest perspective, that being over-reliant on one industry isn't necessarily bad for today, but potentially could be bad for tomorrow. So that is a good thing. But I think it also points to a more general thing that when we come to writing local growth plans, is that invariably, again, if the ones being written now are just like the ones we have seen written in the past, there's a rallying call to build on our key strengths. So our key strengths are X, Y, and Z. This type of analysis should just give a bit pause for thought, because if key strength means, we've got a lot of activity in this one industry and your economy still isn't doing very well, the key question for a place to ask itself might not be, what have we got key strengths in, but actually, where have we got key deficits? What have we not got rather than what we have got? Why is that, and how do we try and address that? And I think particularly from a thinking about the cutting edge element of the economy. If you haven't got very many cutting edge businesses, the question is, well, why is that? Why have we not got very many of them, rather than potentially sort of any, maybe a bit harsh, maybe backslapping of, oh, look, we have got this industry and this activity in whatever industry, which might actually be quite small anyway. You know, just be careful about how over specific we get on that, and thinking about the deficits as well as any potential advantages or key strengths. Then fifth and finally, the one that we look at is location. And this is quite important, I think, particularly thinking about the role that different parts of a region play within the regional economy, or different parts of a city region play within a city region, or indeed different parts of a city play within a city itself. And this chart here is quite a nice illustration of it. So what does it do? It splits the UK into 4 areas. We've got city centres, we've got suburbs, we've got hinterlands around cities, and then we've got more deep-lying rural areas. So think Manchester city centre, v Didsbury, v place just outside Leigh, let's say, of Manchester. Then say Penrith, for example, which would fall into deep rural. A very strong testing of my northwest geography there to pick out those names. I hope I passed. Tell me in the comments. And it looks at 2 indicators. First, on the left-hand side, it looks at area. So what proportion of the country do these different geographies cover? On the right-hand side, it looks at these cutting-edge firms. What proportion of the country's cutting-edge firms fall into these geographies? And there are 2 things to note from this. The first is that if you look at the 2 green circles, which is city centres and suburbs, so basically cities as a whole, they account for around about 9% of land, but 61% of cutting-edge businesses. So there's very much this cutting edge is clustering within cities. So when it comes to thinking about urban v rural in the context of a city region or regional economy, thinking about the role that cities play in terms of their ability to attract in these businesses, which show a clear preference for an urban location, is going to be important. The second point to note is that if we look at that very small dot in the middle, the city centre one, they account for just 0.1% of land, but 18% of these cutting edge businesses. So that is very much telling us in particular that a city centre location is important, and I think not only important today, but probably important tomorrow in terms of the ability of places to attract in these cutting edge businesses. And if your city centre is not functioning in the way that it should be, and not attracting these types of high-end, particularly service-based activities into it, then that's going to be a challenge for your broader city and for your broader city region as well. So think about the role that city centre plays, especially is important as a place of production and as a place that generates prosperity that can be spread over a broader area. So they're all the 5 indicators. Let's pull that all together now. And we do that on one of these radar charts. And it says, right, for all of the cities and large towns that we look at, and you might need to shrink my face in the top right in order to see these charts properly, how well they perform over those indicators. If a city and only one indicator is further to the edges, it's doing well, it ranks well compared to other cities. If it's sort of very much got indicators clustered in the centre, then it's not doing very well on one indicator, or indeed a range of indicators. So I've split this out, obviously having 9 places in the northwest that we look at. If that was all in one chart, it would look messy. So I have split them out, I think, on alphabetical order. No other reason than that. And we can see probably the variation that we get. So if we look at look at the left-hand, well, no, let's look at the right-hand chart first and look at that purple line. That's Warrington. So Warrington's doing very well on size, and so it's got a large export base, and quite a large share of that is in the cutting edge. That's really good news in terms of how well that the prosperity engine performs. A lot of it is in services. Quite a lot of the cutting edge is in city centre as well. The one challenge is probably it's not quite so diversified as a number of other cities, and there's maybe a little bit of a challenge there. Although, as I showed you on the map earlier, in terms of actual figure, it's probably not too much of a concern. If we stick on the right-hand one still, and we look at that, how would we describe that colour for Wigan? I'm not really sure. Olive green, perhaps? Again, let me know in the comments. You can see there that Wigan is quite a lot opposite to what's going on in Warrington. So across pretty much all of the indicators, it is not performing very well. All those dots are towards the centre. Diversity of the export base is probably the only one where there's not so much to worry about. And you can look across the 2 charts and pick out individual cities that you're interested in to see how they're performing. But hopefully this gives a good way of showing a bit of a very quick visual about how well places are doing in terms of their export bases. So that's sort of a deep dive into what Chapter 2 looks at in Cities Outlook, which hopefully gives you lots of interesting information about how places should be thinking about their local growth plans. Let me just show you one other thing, which might well be of interest as well, which is not appearing on my screen currently, if you bear with me for a second. While I pull it up. So as we know from, hopefully, as you remember from what I said at the start, Outlook is not just about the main chapter, but also has a whole range of data on top 10, bottom 10 of a whole load of different indicators. Now, if you flick through the report, if your city's not in the top 10 or bottom 10 of any one of those indicators, you don't know where it lives. So what we've done is we've also created a data tool on our website, which lists all the data for all 63 places that we look at. How you access that is centreforcities.org. You then go through to data here at the top, and then the top option should be the data tool. If we then scroll down, what we get are a number of buttons. So we've got indicators grouped into different categories. You can then click on any one category. Let's click on skills. No, it hasn't worked. There we are. It has worked this time. That will then bring up skills. Then a number of different indicators that you then click on these buttons here: high-level qualifications, no formal qualifications, and school attainment. And it'll provide that data. So it'll give you a top 10, bottom 10. It'll give you a map which you can hover over and get data for individual places. And then it'll give you a chart here as well, where you can see how cities rank. To pull out some interesting things for Northwest, in terms of high skills, Burnley doesn't perform particularly well there. That puts it in the bottom 5 there in terms of its share of its population that have got a degree. We're sort of looking up through the list. You can then see the range all the way through, and perhaps reflecting its broad economic performance. You can see that Warrington is doing pretty well. 1 in 2 of people of working age have got a degree in Warrington, compared to, I think it's about 30%, wasn't it, in Burnley. That gives you a quick overview of what the data tool is. Please do go and have a play with that. Hopefully that gives you lots of information or available information for you to help you throughout the year. And if you have any questions on that, then please do let me know. Great. Right. Let me get into the question and answer session in that case. And a number of people have asked questions already, which is great. Do put your question in the box and we'll see how much we can get through in the next 7 minutes or so. Right. So first one, someone hasn't left their name, but asked a great question is, why is Warrington such an outlier in terms of performance for towns? And is it just the transport links? That's a great question. The short answer is that actually it's not entirely clear why Warrington does so much better than I think some of the other towns around it. The longer answer is, yes, it's clearly well placed in terms of transport links. It is, you saw there from the data tool there, it's got a large share of people with high skill qualifications as well, which probably puts it in a good place in terms of trying to attract in those types of businesses. And I think because it's been a new town in the past, or a new town designation in the past, it's probably had a development or an attitude towards development, which has perhaps made it a bit easier to attract jobs in, particularly I think in some of those out of town parks that it does pretty well in terms of then it's attracting a lot of life science in particular as a result of that. So a number of different combinations there that probably make Warrington slightly different to other parts of the Northwest. The key challenge for the Northwest, of course, is that while Warrington is a strong performer, it is actually still quite small. And the real, I think, challenge for the broader prosperity in the Northwest is the underperformance of Manchester and Liverpool relative to their size, which then has a much bigger implication for the performance of the Northwest economy. But Warrington is not only just a star performer in the Northwest, but in the UK as a whole. I've got another. David Farnsworth asked exactly the same question about new towns as well, and also pulls out the new town. Sorry, about Warrington, and pulls out the new towns question as well. Ivan Turek asks if we have any evidence on the economic relationships and interactions between cities in the Northwest. This is something where there isn't a great deal of data available to understand that. So I think there are 2 ways you would try and measure this. I think the first is commuter flows between the cities, in which we do have data for. And the second one is business to business flows and links, be that through either businesses buying things off one another or perhaps interacting with each other and seeing business travel off the back of that. That second one, we don't have much information on. On the first one, in terms of commuting, what we do know is that actually there isn't a great deal of commuting between the different city regions at the very least. Warrington is probably a slight counter to that, where there are quite a large share of people commuting to Liverpool and commuting to Manchester. But within Greater Manchester, people who live in Greater Manchester tend to live there, work there, sorry. Within Liverpool City region, people who live there tend to work there as well. And this is actually something we see, repeated on the continent too. You don't tend to see these sort of vast flows of commuting from one city to another. What you tend to see is that if people choose to live in a city, work in a city, they tend to then choose to live in that same city. If they want an urban living, they're going to live close as they can to their job. If they want more rural living, then they're going to live outside of the city, but they're still going to try and reduce their commuting time as much as possible, which means that from a Liverpool City region perspective, you're probably a little bit into Cheshire or into Lancashire. Definitely the case from a Manchester perspective is that your Cheshire or a little bit of Derbyshire or into Lancashire, you're not necessarily going into West Yorkshire so much. And as I say, this is something which is repeated on the continent too. So I think sometimes those city-to-city links are, we think, a little bit overblown, which then has implications for how much emphasis people put on trying to improve train links between cities and the subsequent economic performance. We are a little bit more dubious that will have as big an impact as maybe some people predict, even though the Chancellor did actually pull that out again today at her speech earlier as an issue that she wants to address. Be cautious there as to whether that really is the problem. We've got another question here from Olamide. I apologise, Olamide, if I got your name totally wrong there. What are the most effective fixes for cities to implement in their city regions to attract exporting businesses? Well, that will vary probably from place to place, but I think it is trying to understand what those barriers are. From a local level, those things are going to be something around skill levels, transport connections. Now, that's public as well as private. Housing, and particularly density of that housing, and how much of that is close to the city centre, or is it sprawling? They have questions around public realm as well. I think they're the types of things that places should be assessing. And when they think about, well, why are these businesses not coming here in the numbers that they should be? How do we perform across all those different metrics, which then might take you into the realms of what policy might try and do? I'd be a bit more sceptical if the growth plans then say, egged on by central government, no doubt, we're going to be a centre for creative industries, so therefore we're going to only look at the issues that creative industries face. Actually, I think that's too narrow. The question is how to attract an export business more generally. And if you want to refine that down the cutting edge as a group, we're probably not trying to be overly specific about it and thinking about what are the barriers in place and trying to address them. Still got a number of questions, which is excellent. We're close to time. Let's get through the next one. Nick Chamberlain says, do we look at community health as a measure of economic health, given the pressure on the NHS? The short answer to that is no. It tends to fall outside of our remit, looking sort of very specifically at the economy. But I can see sort of how those two things are linked in terms of if somebody can't contribute to the economy because of their health, there's clearly a challenge there. So there's space for us to do work on that, but we haven't looked at that specifically. Alexander Peel says, it's clear that cities should be attracting new economy jobs and firms to their urban centres. Is there any data to suggest how long the delay is for this prosperity to start showing itself? Which is a great question. There isn't, although I think you will then start to see, the mechanism for that will be if a business comes in and it then creates those positions, then I think that prosperity is then probably generated as soon as the wages are starting to be paid. I think the issue probably is what's the scale of that prosperity being generated, and that will depend on the volume of businesses. The broader or the longer term challenges or lags that you'll see, which again the Chancellor was challenged on this morning in her speech, is if the investment is not, the businesses come in and it's opened up shop and then, the jobs are created, but actually we're going to invest in skills and invest in public transport and invest in office stock. Clearly, there are much larger lags to that. So in terms of addressing those broader barriers, then attracting businesses in, and then they start to generate prosperity, there are larger time lags there, of which I don't think there's any strong idea about how long that time lag is. But I think the crucial thing to that is that if those barriers are there, we need to remove them. And the time it takes shouldn't be seen as the reason not to do it. It's that we need to get cracking now in order to feel that prosperity in 3 years' time rather than not feel that prosperity at all. I think to some degree, that's how we need to think about it. Obviously, from a political context, that's a bit of a challenge if you have an election which is shorter than 3, 4, 5, 6 years time, which certainly the national level will feel, but also the mayors will feel to some extent as well. Final question, as I know I'm 1 minute over time already, but just to wrap up, Ruth says, it's a little confusing with the Manchester shape on the last slide. What was happening on size there? Right, good question. So this is not just absolute size, but it's size of export base relative to the size of population. So we're using that to try and sort of configure, normalize the data a bit so we can get a good understanding of what's going on. Now, in absolute terms, Manchester has a very large export base, but relative to the size of the city, actually its export base isn't very big compared to that size. It should be much bigger than what it currently is, particularly given that it is a large city, especially, and should we have a more natural advantage of attracting in high-skilled exporting firms in particular. So when you start to compare the export base relative to its population, we see that actually it isn't as big as what it should be, and that's a key challenge. What it has got is fairly productive, but there isn't enough of it, and that needs to expand, not only for Manchester's prosperity, but the Northwest prosperity and the UK prosperity as well, given the role that it plays in the national economy. Marvellous. I'm going to pause there because we managed to get through all of the questions, just 2 minutes over time as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Thank you very much for your questions. I hope that was helpful. If you have any more questions that we can help with, please do feel free to drop me a line. All the resources that come with Cities Outlook are on our website, centreforcities.org, so please do go and have a look at that too if you're intrigued to find out more. And if you are interested in any other regions, we are running a number of other deep dives in the coming weeks as well, so you can find that on our website. Thank you very much. I hope to see you in person too. I am open to invites to any of the places that you work in, so please do send those through. We can arrange a city visit.